Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome in our program Encounter. As you can see today, our set is different because we are dealing with a very specific topic with archaeology, cultural mapping, and today our guests are Dr. Krish Sita from Stanford University, California, and Dr. Alexandra Chanchosi from Amsterdam University. And today we are going to see what kind of project is being carried out by these archaeologists at Puliar, Antoinette. Dr. Krish Sita, we welcome you to our program. Please tell us what is the objective of this archaeological survey at Puliar and how are you proceeding with the cultural mapping on this site?
Well, we've been given a mandate by the Apravasigat Trust Fund to better understand the relationships between different components of the site. We also have wonderful oral histories from the indentured labourers who lived here and worked on the estate, and we like to bring all of these elements together. We want to understand the relationship between where people lived and where they worked, not only in the plantations but also with the mill as well. So this is a really significant site because this is truly where the indentured experience began. We understand that the depot, which is now a World Heritage Site, Apravasigat, was where the labourers were disembarked, where the immigration process took place, but this is where they worked. So it's really important for us to understand the relationships on this site, the lifeways of the people who lived here, what their narratives are, and to connect what we see at Puliar with not only the wider context of indentured labour itself, but the other plantations and other sites where indentured labourers worked on Mauritius itself.
When we are talking about this project, the terminology cultural mapping is always being in the limelight. So please tell us, what is cultural mapping exactly?
Well, it's probably a bit of a misnomer. We are mapping this site, so there's a physical process of mapping various elements of the site using relatively advanced techniques to reference and spatially orientate different components of the site itself. But cultural heritage is what we are mapping. So all of these elements, the buildings, the structures, the narratives, the stories, these are all elements of cultural heritage. So we're attempting to map these two things together to gain a picture that makes more sense, gives us understanding, and really helps us to situate how the labourers lived when on these sites.
So you've been working together with the local communities and researchers from the Apravasigat Trust Fund. So tell us about the experience, how it has been going.
So we've had a relationship with the Apravasigat Trust Fund since 2009. Really our work on indenture, the archaeology, the cultural heritage of indenture is virtually unique to Mauritius, and under the auspices and aegis of the Apravasigat Trust Fund, we've found a home basically to situate this type of archaeology. This is effectively a new form, the archaeology of indenture. This is a new form of archaeology, a new sub-discipline developing, and our own project, the Mauritian Archaeology and Cultural Heritage Project, sits within this broader framework under Stanford University, of course. And so our relationship has been very long-standing. Puliar, we've actually come to this site in 2015-16. We've worked on Bradeux, we've worked on Trianon, Bois Marchand, Île Plate, Île Gabriel. There's a number of islands and islets and sites that we brought together into, or the attempt is to bring into a cohesive understanding of what the indentured experience was like from the point, perhaps even from the point before of arrival, the ships and so on, but the point of immigration and then the dispersal into the landscape of Mauritius to work on plantations and to begin the process of establishing a new community here.
I would like you to explain to the audience more about archaeology. What is archaeology? When you talk of a new form of archaeology, we would like to know the different steps that archaeology includes.
So we can think that, so this is a personal opinion to a certain extent, but it's also one that's held by a lot of people, that archaeology is a science of the past. We want to use the most advanced techniques that we can. We want to use applications, tools, equipment that builds an understanding in as much detail. And we are not in support of history, but we also use history. We're not in conflict with history either. We want to bring, in effect, history is part of our data set too, and we can contribute a lot to history with the kind of resolution of information that we have. So archaeology is very much towards the sciences, although it's still a humanities subject, and we want to understand where were people coming from, maybe using DNA analysis. What were people eating? Looking at the remnants of their food, whether it's very small phytoliths, which we can't really see unless we're using a microscope, or the larger seeds. We found chickpea, for example, at Trianon. So it's about applying scientific approaches, interpretation of the past, to build a really broad and detailed picture of how different groups of people, so we're talking about indentured labourers here, how did they live? What networks were they connected to? What was the diaspora like for them? What diseases do they suffer from? And what was their food ways? What was their cuisine? What were the day-to-day contexts of their life like? What was their working life like? What kind of signatures on their body? Did a hard life, cutting sugarcane for, in some cases, decades, what kind of signature did that leave on an individual body?
Please tell us, how do we decide? When do we have to have an archaeological digging, an archaeological survey on a site?
One of the challenges in Mauritius is that we don't have a mandate for archaeological assessment prior to construction in the same way that we would have an environmental assessment. So we want to make sure environmentally, before a large building is situated, we need to make sure that we have an environmental assessment. We don't do that for archaeology at the moment. Let's hope that's something for the future. It's certainly something that would be positive. The thing to explain, and maybe bringing those two questions together, archaeology is not against development. We would only like to ask that you allow us to recover the information before your development. So that's sort of one broad picture. The more detailed, on a site like this, you can already see that many of the stones, pierre, the stones that were used in construction of these buildings have been taken away. They've been robbed. So we would like to record as early as possible before we start seeing the removal of materials, the damage. There's literally a wall built into a tree at the moment because the tree has grown all around it. So before this destructive phase takes over. But really the archaeology can be brought in at any stage. Even if there's been a lot of destruction, we of course excavate and we can recover so much material artifacts that really reveal much more than we would anticipate. So the core thing to understand, particularly on a site like this where we have a lot of standing archaeology, is that what we see above is a fraction of what we can recover underneath. So we can manage between those, we can negotiate between those two elements so that we can actually really reveal a lot about the cultural past.
And once the archaeological survey is done, the digging is done, what is the next step once the archaeological survey is over?
Just a slight clarification there. There's survey, which we do before excavation. And what you're seeing on site now is that we're opening test trenches. These are not full-scale excavations. So archaeology is a very complex and long process. It can be a long process where we undertake survey first using entirely non-destructive approaches. This can be followed with the destructive process of excavation. But what we would do then is incorporate all of that information, in a sense, as you said, a mapping. But we'll also undertake subsequent analysis. So if we happen to find human remains, we can look at the DNA of the individuals. We can date various types of artifacts. We can look at diet. We can also have a complete analysis of all the different classes of materials, so glass, brick, tile, porcelain, etc., coins. All of these things really help us to build the picture. So after a process of analysis, we can really bring together a much more clear picture, even from a site that's relatively self-contained, built on the material, the historical, the ethnographic, and the spatial analysis.
You just mentioned destructive process. How far it is destructive? Is it reversible?
No, that's the underlying principle of archaeology. It's as soon as you open into the ground, you've effectively destroyed the archaeology. It can't be repeated. That's why we're not a strict science. But destructive, I'm very grateful that you asked the question, because destructive is not in this full-scale context. What we open, the very small artifacts that we recover, the information that we take, I mean the small number of artifacts that we recover, all of that is then, the earth is then replaced. So in principle, of course, somebody could reopen that site, but we've taken the information already, it's not necessary. And we leave the site in the state that we found it, minus the fact that we've taken information that's critical to our understanding of the site. So destructive is a very, we should use that word very carefully, and I'm glad you give me a chance to explain it more clearly.
Thank you. Dr. Alexandra, please tell us, as an archaeologist, how you find this site, Puliar. How far this survey is going to help in the documentation, further documentation of the site?
I think this site is really exceptional and could be an exemplary site to understand the indenture history and in particular the management of a sugar estate. And it is extraordinary because we have many buildings that are very well preserved, and the most of the quarters in which the sugar estate was divided can be understood and can be mapped through our work, our research as archaeologists. And for sure can be the base also to understand and to investigate other sites that are similar to this sugar estate.
When you're talking about similarities, which are the sites that have been similar to that of Puliar?
Yeah, in the past here in Mauritius, collaborating with Professor Sita at the MAC project, we worked together at Brado sugar estate. So we start the mapping of the site, and in particular the main aim of that project was to find the houses where the workers stay and lived, and in comparison with this site, the preservation of that building, of those buildings were very bad. So I can see the difference, and for this reason we have already collected some data about another sugar estate, and specifically about the dwellings where indentured workers lived. And now we have a different site, but that we can compare, and in particular this site was used until very recent times. So the possibility to have also the oral history of people that lived here was incredible.
Please tell us how the local communities have been assisting, guiding you in the project in Puliar.
I think that their contribution was extraordinary because for the first time, from my experience, I have the opportunity to try to give an interpretation, for example, of one of these buildings, the transformation of a building, and then immediately the day after listen to their story, have the confirmation or many more details about the life here and how the building was transformed, how it was used when they live here. And so we can see that the usual work team that we experience in archaeology was enriched by this great contribution.
So how is the work progressing together with the information that you're getting from the people here?
Yeah, so for example, we decided to investigate opening a trench test between two buildings, because we would like to understand typology of artifacts and the stratigraphy that we can find between these two buildings. And the contribution by these people was that we listened from their voice that this space was used as a corridor, a passage to go behind the building and where the toilet was, for example. So we can integrate the information that we can have from the material culture that we find in the ground with the oral history of their experience.
The Apravasika Trust Fund started research on Antoinette Sugar Estate and the ruins at Antoinette Sugar Estate for some time now. In 2015 we had a booklet. In 2016 we had a commemorative ceremony organized to mark the memory of the people. The site is known as the first place where indentured laborers were employed, the first 36 who came in 1834. But now, apart from the site history, we want to know more about the people. It will be difficult to find the direct information from people who were here in 1830s. So we have to go through other indirect ways. One of the ways is archaeology, which looks at the remains on the site, which is why we are working in collaboration with archaeologists from Stanford University. The special aspect of this survey that we have this year is cultural mapping, where we had an interaction with the local community. The people from the villages of Barlow, La Maurie, Petite Julie, Bellevue-Morel, even Rivière-du-Rempart are people who also come from Antoinette Sugar Estate. They worked or even lived on the sugar estate at some point in their life. They actually showed us the small details, where the building started, where they ended, where the kitchens were, where the rubbish was being thrown, where the veranda was, where all the buildings and structures that have disappeared now, where they were actually located. So the cultural mapping has done a lot because it has brought out some information that was not visible in historical documents. Historical documents do not always talk about the daily life of the people. So through archaeology and oral history and cultural mapping, we are able to put the bits and pieces together, fill in the gaps to better understand the conditions of these people.
Please tell us what is the relationship between Apravasikat and the projects that you're carrying out with your team and the various projects that you have been carrying out in Mauritius.
The best place to start is to make it very clear the role that Apravasigat has as a World Heritage Site, an institution in Mauritius that's mandated to study and research and disseminate knowledge on indenture. So that's the much broader overarching principle. And without an institution like that, the study of indenture doesn't have a clear home at the moment. Of course, there's people who study the history of indenture. There are other elements being studied. I don't want to detract. But Apravasigat is an institute entirely dedicated to the study of indenture. So it gives us an institutional home attached to the Ministry of Arts and Culture as well. So it really provides a platform from which the research that we are doing can be elevated. It can reach the public, it can reach the minister, it can reach the board members of AGTF, and so that they are also the first front in disseminating this information. We publish our work. There's several papers, several articles that have been published on the archaeology of indenture. But all of these projects then help us knit together a broader picture. And so as I maybe could elaborate slightly, we know very little about the journey from, whether it's India or other parts of the world, to bring indentured labourers to Mauritius. We know that there was the immigration depot here, and it's recognized as a leader in the world for what happens to the indentured labourers. And we start to understand something about when those indentured labourers arrived in Mauritius, how were they dispersed into the landscape, and to start to work. And we then have an opportunity to transition from cultural heritage to cultural heritage tourism.
With all the projects you've been involved in Mauritius, I'm sure you've developed quite a big capacity building among researchers and heritage professionals.
It's actually been our mandate from the beginning. We've always worked with local heritage institutions, with local academic institutions, with NGOs, with National Heritage Fund, with other government institutions as well. Because archaeology was not particularly, it existed in Mauritius, but it hadn't sort of reached a public audience in the way that we hope we can try to achieve now. But that will only come with training of local colleagues. So whether it's on the terrestrial side, we have students from the University of Mauritius, Architecture School and so on who join us. We have, of course, colleagues from Apravasigat, local community who have always supported our work, for example, at Puliar, but also Bradeux, Bois Marchand, we've had local community help us. And that's given us an opportunity because it's difficult to teach archaeology in the classroom. it's very good to teach archaeology in the field. So that's what we do. We take the students, they work with us. And we've had groups of students working with us for many years. And we hope that that builds local capacity, it builds a tradition and institutionalizes the discipline of archaeology here.
Dr. Alexandra, please tell us about the different projects you've been working on in Mauritius.
Especially in these last 2-3 years, I focused my interest in the study of Flat Island, Île Plate, that was a quarantine station used specifically for the indentured laborers that came from India in particular to Mauritius. And Flat Island was the first place that where they arrived when their ship should be diverted for the presence of disease or sick people on board. And this site is really the best quarantine station preserved in the Indian Ocean. My interest is more also on the research of the cemetery of that was used in the quarantine station that can be compared with the data that we have already collected in other sites in Mauritius like Bois Marchand and Lemoore.
Okay, talking about Bois Marchand, Dr. Krish, I would like you to say more on the project that you carried out at Bois Marchand, the archaeological survey and the archaeological digging.
That was one of the most impressive sites that we've worked on within the context of indentured diaspora. Of course, Bois Marchand, as you know, is still a functioning cemetery. All the populations, groups, ethnic groups in Mauritius are inhumed, are buried there. And we were very fortunate. Unfortunately, he's now deceased, but the former cemetery director was able to provide us with an indication of where we should actually excavate a portion of a cemetery that was never reopened after 1868. So the cemetery was first established in 1867 specifically because of an epidemic of malaria. And that was a particularly shocking year because somewhere in the region of 41,000 people, 10% of the population at that time died, suggestedly from malaria. Bois Marchand, it's a little known fact, but it was the largest cemetery in the southern hemisphere when it was first established, over 400 acres. So it gives you immediately an indication of the impact of disease on the colonial machine. The movement of people, the need for labor was completely undermined by the presence of a disease like malaria, but also many other diseases, cholera, yellow fever, etc. So Bois Marchand is a very important site in that it gives us a snapshot of a population under conditions of epidemic, of an outbreak. And we've very recently been through our own conditions of an outbreak, of a pandemic in this case with COVID. So we understand not only the economic impacts, but I think it's very clear to our contemporary population of the social impact of epidemic disease. So we want to study where the individuals were coming from, really to try to identify specifically which form of malaria they were affected with, how different proportions of the population and different regions of the island were affected by this disease. Was there particular areas where the disease was effectively a hotspot? Was it safer to be on a plantation? So, for example, we've spoken to ethnographically here to people who lived on this sugar estate at Puliar, who said they never really suffered from any serious incidents of malaria, despite it affecting the island as a whole, because on the plantations they were somewhat protected from the broader impacts of disease. However, Port Louis was very much affected. So Bois Marchand is an incredibly important site. Again, it's one of those sites that with the support and help of the AGTF, the technical team, administrative, and of course the board, we are able to study, and we hope to continue studying, what is perhaps one of the most important episodes as it relates between the context of disease, the colonial world, and the indentured diaspora.
Now that you've worked on so many projects in Mauritius, after Puliar, what is your next project? I mean, what will be the next step?
We really hope that Puliar can become a heritage village. There's desperate need to bring value to descendant communities of indentured labourers. We have very little understanding of individual lifeways, and yet we still have a connection. We still have individuals who were living and working on these estates at that time. But as you can see, the remnants of these structures themselves have very much deteriorated. There's an excellent mill, chimney. There's a really important historical and archaeological context connecting these sites. And we hope that these can all be integrated into an attraction not only for tourists, but also for local community, local population, a site of celebration for the indentured diaspora, a place for community to come together and really reminisce, but also learn about the reason and the people who came to Mauritius first.
Dr. Krish, Dr. Alexandra, thank you very much for taking out your precious time from your fieldwork, and thanks for having us on site. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching the program. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, goodbye.